Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode, if we dare call that, of Conversations from the Edge. We have the renowned Josephin Peladan scholar Sasha Chaitow coming to us from Greece, I believe it is, which I am jealous because while I have access to wonderful Mediterranean food from our elderly Greek and Syrian Orthodox churches around here, I am in northeastern Pennsylvania, so it is cold right now. Actually, it's kind of warm. We're maybe topping out around 34 degrees, so it's not. We're lucky. That's warm weather for January. But Sasha, how is the weather where you're at?
Well, there's no need to be jealous at all because we're going through a horrible cold snap. There's sort of this polar sort of front coming down from Siberia. So it's utterly freezing. And
Oh, I'm so sorry for you.
all
Oh,
right. It's a rare occurrence. We may even get snow, and that's exciting. So there you go. Haven't once in 30 years. So there you go.
well, you can have my snow. I'm tired of shoveling it. But
Oh,
with that said, in terms of weather, whenever we think of weather in Paris, we always think of it either as a wonderful spring day or just this kind of terrible, damp environment, which is what we see from a lot of the depictions of the Belle Epoque. And that's what we're going to talk about.
yeah.
And I want to say I've been following your work for about 10 years now, and I am thrilled that it is getting a wider audience. And like many things, it gets a wider audience when we have a course or two on it that we open to the public because you are a scholar. And for better or worse, that means you bring a lot of talent and a lot of skill and insight. But unfortunately, it means that for the longest time, our work, when we're in scholarly work, is kind of in a tomb. And it is limited to a small group of people. And we don't want that for what you've got to offer. You've got some great stuff. And just to show the listeners what a blessing your research is. Back in the day, when I was interested, and I've been interested in the French Occult Revival since before I could shave, we had to order books, special order them, pay special fees to get them delivered. And, this was about all we could get. This is Eliphas Levi and the French Occult Revival by McIntosh.
Indeed.
This one is Occult Symbolism in France by Picus Wittens. And this cost a small fortune in its day. I think now, well, for a while, it was still around $300 just to get a copy if you could find one. But now we have, in the last few years, a tremendous interest in things. And we have Tobias Churton's Occult Paris. Okay. And of course, translations of How to Become a Mage. So I want you to take this kind of introduction of how blessed folks are and run with it and tell us a little bit about yourself. And then let's get talking about Peladon.
Well, indeed, we are lucky because, I don't think even 20 years ago it was barely possible to believe that you could study such a thing as Western esotericism at actual university, and yet that's the opportunity I had. My story sort of kicks off with the discovery of the MA in Western esotericism at Exeter University back in 2006, and at the time I'd already finished university. Or so I'd thought, and I had an MA in English literature. I was teaching English in order to fund my art, because before all of that I'd gone to art college, um, but I was looking for a way to somehow develop a symbolic vocabulary to explore the stuff I was really interested in. And I kind of fell sideways into studying Western esotericism the way I did at Exeter. And that's where I realized that all the ideas and the concepts and the strange dreams and the strange experiences that I'd kind of again muddled my way through had names, and I wasn't the first to discover them, and they were part of something much bigger, and they had a history, and I could study it. And that's how I essentially fell sideways, quite literally, into scholarship. And so I focused mainly on alchemy and alchemical symbolism, at that time for my master's degree, and then I decided to go on and do a PhD. And for one reason and another, and synchronicity being what it is, I ended up doing it on Josephin Peladan and doing a full kind of from the ground up study of his system, of his whole output, literally his whole output, because that had never been done, or it had never been done from an academic perspective. It had been done from a sort of esoteric perspective in the 1950s roundabout. Yeah, by Edouard Berthollet, who's
Mhm.
actually done an excellent kind of summary overview of Peladan's work, but it's very hard to get hold of. It's only out there in French. I think it's been reprinted, but it's still only in French. And I ended up doing a full-scale study of everything Peladan had ever put out there, and essentially tried to put him in the context of the French Occult Revival. And in English, which was again, I was the first to do that since the Pinker-Switten study that you held up earlier, which was pretty much the only, that and the reference in Chris McIntosh's book were the only kind of things I had to go on starting out. And also Chris McIntosh's book on the Rosicrucians, the history of
Mhm.
Rosicrucianism. And that's kind of all I had to go on to start with.
Well, and
So yeah,
well,
that's
for our listeners who aren't familiar with it, the French Occult Revival was a period in late 19th century France, uh, starting with Elvis Levy, and then having a high point. After that, mostly from the 18, what would we say, 70s to about 1914. It ends with the First World War, and this is very influential to Anglo-Saxon uh, esotericism because indirectly as well as directly, a great deal of the Golden Dawn is also influenced by some of that early work, particularly Levy's work and some of the other folks. So just for those who aren't familiar with that term, and that the French Occult Revival is, of course, saying here is a revival of occultism, meaning that it had existed at another time and other times. And it is not the only revival of the time. There's the British or English Occult Revival, which brings us to Golden Dawn in 1888. We have a German and Austrian Occult Revival. We have also one in Russia, which is not well researched, which does connect to the French. And of course, there is an American Occult Revival going on at the same time, which will carry on past the First World War and even past the Second World War. So just kind of giving our listeners a context for it, that they have been influenced by this, whether they recognize it or not, and probably indirectly through Harvey Lewis's Amorc, Ancient Mystical Order Rosicrucius, and the wonderful folks down on Quakertown, Pennsylvania, the Rosicrucian. They're not the Fellowship. Who are they? Which one? I should know them. Oh, Climbers Group. Climbers Group. He made connections to the groups of that same period. Those groups were fascinating characters. Tell us a little bit about some of the people. Who was Peladon? Who was he running with? What was his circle of miscreants?
well, I mean, he he was an outsider in a way, in some respects, because he arrives in Paris from Nîmes, sorry, not Nice, and he was essentially looking to establish himself as a writer. He had to earn a living, got a brief job doing something terribly boring, and realized he wasn't going to survive that way. So he eventually got himself a job as an art critic, writing reviews of art exhibitions and so on, and essentially publishes his first book, his first novel, that is, La Vie Suprême, and that falls into the hands of a young man who would become Stanislas de Gaeta. And it's de Gaeta who takes Peladon, who at that time is mostly in literary circles, you see. He's not in occult circles, and he's not really looking for them either. But de Gaeta is, and having spent some time learning from Peladon, and searching for others to kind of further his dream of creating a college of mages that would bring together all different streams of occultism under one roof. He meets Papoose and introduces Peladon to Papoose, and so he's already been joined. Papoose is already in the company of Oswald Worth and Alexandra Santi Dalveja and several other figures who we would probably recognize. This is in the late 1880s, early 1890s. No, it's in the late 1880s. This is because by 1890, Peladon had already fallen out with a lot of them and went off and started his own thing, which is probably what he was intending to do all along.
Now, Giota and Worth, they bring us one of the most influential standardizations of the tarot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they're important to our listeners. And the Worth Tarot was reissued several years back by Weiser. It had been unavailable for quite a while, and those unfamiliar with the book, the Tarot of the Magicians, I think is the English translation, I think it's called. It's worth looking at to see how they deal with the colors and the symbolisms and the cards. And it's very different. The French approach to the tarot was very different from the heavily standardized approach that we see coming out of the Golden Dawn later on. And Papoose even had his own Egyptian tarot, the Egyptian themes, which kind of leads us to now the question. They have this falling out, and this is what we call the wonderful War of the Roses, as some refer to it. But what was the falling out about? And what were the differences in approach? Because they're both looking at initiatic streams. Papoose brings us, which is not his name, that's his initiatic name of so that is the initiatic name of which is we find throughout Martinism. Okay, so we see this revival, at least so they claim, of a Martinist tradition. And then we see along with that a Rosicrucian college, or the idea of the Rose-Croix Kabbalist, okay, coming about. So Martinism, they'd go through these degrees, and that would be kind of the stepping stone into the Rose-Croix Kabbalist. And as you said, these folks would get kind of like a college level education in operative occultism, is what was the goal of many of these folks. Okay. What caused the blowout? What were the differences? Give us the gossip.
Oh, the real gossip involves wigs and false beards. It's hilarious. it's absolutely hilarious because this was front page news in Paris for the time that it was sort of really heated up. But I mean, the bottom line was that Papoose and de Gaeta and the rest of them really had established, and it's quite amazing if you think about it for the time and imagine had it lasted. But these things tend not to last. A very structured and, as you say, college almost style school of esotericism, operative occultism. But it did follow a kind of regimented degree structure, what we scholars call a quasi-Masonic structure, as in sort of step-by-step degrees with secrets and oaths and kind of quite detailed elaborate ritual, and so on. Now, Peladon didn't like Freemasonry, didn't like secrecy, did not like the idea of closed orders, and there are a good number of reasons for this. Did not like the fact they'd also grafted in ideas borrowed from Theosophy, so there was also a lot of exchange with the Theosophical Society. Did not like the integration of Eastern ideas into this kind of what can we call it? Fusion, if you like, of different esoteric streams. And there were ideological reasons, there were philosophical reasons that for why he took this position. And there were also personality clashes. There's no denying that, especially with Oswald. They hated each other. And
But
he also,
why? Why did they hate each other?
I'm not sure. Well, Peladon wasn't, he wasn't easy to get on with. I think there's no denying that. The guy was opinionated and made sure everybody knew it. And he seems to have come across as quite flamboyant, even though, again, there's a reason for that. And he explains those reasons,
Mhm.
but we'll get to that, I'm sure. And so, also because Peladon was openly dismissive of Freemasonry, which for Worth, of course, was the ultimate system. So, there's a clash of ideology right there.
Well,
Uh,
what's not too well known as well is that Papoose not so secretly was hoping that Martinism could become the crowning jewel of Masonry,
yeah.
something even above and beyond Scottish Rite. That this would be, well, in the United States, we got the Shriners, but there was that goal. So
Yeah.
the Masons, Freemasonry was somewhat, as you see over the decades of that time, really somewhat skeptical of many of these esoteric orders for that reason. The
Mhm.
relationship was not always an easy one. Yeah. So they had plans, these guys. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 they did, and of course, I think it's worth bringing in the context, the sort of the background context here, that this is a France where organized religion has been thrown out of the window decades earlier. This is a country without a place for the soul, and that, of course, is the sort of aftermath of the French Revolution and Robespierre and there were various efforts completely unrelated to our esoteric friends. There were various efforts to create churches of humanism and churches to the human spirits and secular sort of organizations that would provide a place for the human spirit, but dispensed with all the evils of organized religion as the people of the time saw it. And this left a huge, huge gap, and it did become a free for all. So the French Occult Revival is really one of those phenomena that kind of comes in to also try to address this, among other gaps, even though it comes quite late in the game. But it's been brewing. It's certainly been brewing across that century. And so this vision of Papoose, it really makes sense in that context. However, Peladon had different ideas because I mean, I'd almost call him a bit of a purist.
Okay.
As I've kind of even taken a step back from this, my very close study of him, um, he wants to try to be faithful to some of the traditions that he sees as valuable, and he doesn't want to try to kind of graft them into something else. He wants to let them stand for what they are on their own, and that means you can't then create this fusion of a system, because that's going to force you to make changes to something that has its own history. And so for all those reasons, and like I say, for Paladin, the idea of having a closed order with regimented degrees, in particular with a hierarchy, to him was almost anathema. And it was almost anathema because deep down, and everything he did thereafter was really based on the idea of the independence and autonomy and self-sufficiency of the human spirit. And the idea that one would be in a master-disciple relationship, for him, negated, it kind of invalidated the possibility of ever acquiring that autonomy. So,
Now, what was the focal point of his work? And what I've noticed in a lot of and of course, this also gave rise to the salons of the period. So there were art shows around Peladon's work, but the Grail seemed to play a focal point, if I'm not correct, in some of the work.
not no, well, as a symbol perhaps,
Okay.
but not as much as it's such a powerful word, and concept, and it carries so much the whole sort of Grail quest, that it often kind of seems that way. But when he speaks of, seek the grail, he's actually just talking about seek awakening, seek self-awareness, and seek the ultimate kind of goal being the reintegration and discovery of the divine and one's own divine nature. That's what he's really talking about. And he borrowed and he used every motif, every tropy from myth and various from world mythology, in fact, that would serve that purpose. So whether he's talking about the Grail quest, whether he's talking about Prometheus, or whether he's talking about Egyptian or Babylonian sort of myths, it's all kind of tuned towards the focal point for Peladon is not one or other specific tradition, but it's the end goal of it's Orphic, really. It's discover the divine within you and then work with it until you've essentially completed the hermetic god-making sort of process, at which point you, and meanwhile, help wake others up as you go. But it's really about the individual and the individual self-discovery and self-awakening.
Well, what would be some of the methods that he suggested? Because, of course, looking at what is written or in How to Become a Mage in this book, there's some interesting ideas. We see him as a very flamboyant character, often using the initiatic title of Tsar. Maybe you could explain what that means. And he seems to have, at least in the images that appear of him, the photographs, somewhat of a preference for the Babylonian approach or symbolism. Maybe you could elaborate on that for us.
Sure. Well, let me again just contextualize before I get to that, that to Peladon, there were essentially three broad categories of people in society. Okay, and he followed Plato in kind of identifying the mob, who he completely gave up on, didn't even try to approach. The category that Peladon calls animique, which it actually derives in his terminology from the word from animist, or something that is ensouled, something that is alive and souled, but not quite awake. And that's the kind of second category, and that's the broadest group that he targeted the most, actually. And then the group that he calls intellectuals, also who you can also call initiates, and this is his categorization, not mine. So he produced work, all again aiming at exactly the same thing, the sort of the self-awareness, self-determination, but tuned to each of these groups separately. So for the animique, he developed the salons, and we'll talk about that perhaps in the art and how role that was meant to play a little later. But in terms of his initiatory name and the material and how to become a mage, that is directed, and it should be understood in context, because when you throw a book like that out there, if the context isn't provided, then people aren't, it's not going to read right, it's not going to code right, I think is the term nowadays. Now, that is the first in a sequence of a series of 7 handbooks, essentially manuals for self-initiation, and that particular one is aimed at young men, and he actually says that he's aiming it at young men who are around 20 and seeking the same things he was seeking at that age, but not finding them. And what he talks about in there is the process of the process of basically sculpting your own character and your own personality, just like a sculptor would from a block of marble. And one of the techniques he recommends is the idea of acting the part that you of who you want to become even when you feel within yourself that you haven't got there yet. So even if internally you still feel very confused and very lost, but you know you want to become something better, then he says, basically, make the acts of faith and the faith will come. He quotes St. Ignatius somewhere in there. And what he's saying by that is, okay, you want to become, in this particular book, he's talking to young men. So you want to become a man of a certain caliber with certain characteristics. And of course, he talks about the virtues that one should embody anyway. Then you need to externalize that in your dress, in your outward appearance, and so on and so forth. And by externalizing it, eventually you will come to embody, and by behaving appropriately, you'll come to embody it as well.
Well,
And
I was going to say, just for the listeners, contextually, this is important because we see this in the term known as assumption of the God form. We see it in Tantra as what's called the generation stage in terms of tantric practices. But within psychosynthesis, which was coming out of the tail end of that period, we see the acting as if model. So this notion is well established and integrated across a variety of practices. And it's summed up in the term in the recovery community as fake it till you make it. So there's a great deal of value in this. But you mentioned the word that is anathema these days for most esoteric practices, which is the virtues. So what is virtue in that context? What was Peladon saying that were the qualities that you needed to cultivate?
So I mean, it's really going by the Greek or Platonic, the ancient Greek virtues. So I'm not sure why that should be anathema, but I may miss something. But I mean, we're talking about balancing out, essentially. I don't have them off by heart, but we're talking about
Sure.
honorable, being truthful, being true to one's words,
Mhm.
all of honoring one's talents. That's a really big one for Peladon. It's honoring one's
Okay.
talents, because he really he acknowledges, first of all, he acknowledges, and I still haven't answered your question about Babylonian mages, but we can come back to that. He's First of all, he acknowledges that there are many different temperaments and personality types, and he presents this system, and that's all in that book, in fact.
Mhm.
But like I said, it deserved better context in
Yes.
because otherwise it's kind of really difficult to penetrate. Um, so he acknowledged that there were different personality types, and he aligns these. And this, I think, is somewhat arbitrary on his part, but it works. He aligns these to specific Assyrian deities. And so not to your star sign as in your birth sign, but he assigns Assyrian, what he calls astrological signs. So he explains a Solarian man will be like this, a Lunarian man will be like this, and then he mentions some of the other actual deities, and they'll be subject to XY deity, and they will have these characteristics, these strengths, these weaknesses, and he gives advice on how to tackle the weaknesses. So weaknesses could be anything from a lack of confidence to a lack of courage in sort of standing one's ground in a given situation. And it was, they're pretty pragmatic character weaknesses, to be honest, that I think we would even today acknowledge as character weaknesses, or a tendency to have a sharp temper or a sharp tongue, or things like that. So it's very grounded. It's very, what I found with Peladon, for all his flamboyance, which even he himself eventually acknowledged as being misguided, like the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You kind of see that he's a great psychologist in a way. He's a great observer of human nature. So he also then talks about some people being, so that there are men of science. There are people who are going to have to approach this process of self-initiation through totally rational terms, because that's their personality, that's who they are. And it's an equally, he says, it's an equally legitimate path to the path of spirituality. And that's also as legitimate as the intellectual approach. And so he provides all three and gives recommendations for all three types on how to then tackle their own personalities and how to interact with society so as to essentially throw off the shackles of social kind of conformism and be able to blossom into one's true self, depending on where one's talents lay. So the virtues are not in no way, shape or form the virtues of the Catholic Church, but they're very much the ancient Greek as well as very pragmatic personality strengths or lack thereof, really.
Well, it appears that what he's talking about, and of course, I did enjoy the book, um, is very similar to what we see in a lot of contemporary self-help. It doesn't, but of course, there's always going to be that commonality. If there's to be any pragmatic value to it, there has to be that common value of common experience. Where does he begin to build off that? Because we're not saying he arcs off it. He doesn't go off in a different direction. He's clearly having you do this to lay a foundation. Where is this foundation taking you? And of course, he did write a book for young women as well. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about the other five. Well, that's his one volume. What are the other 6 volumes? Just maybe a brief description of where they went, what their purpose was.
So the first one, How to Become a Mage, is for young men. The second one, How to Become a Fairy, but that sounds dreadful in English, but it's actually, he qualifies it, is for young women. How to become, there's a word play in this one. It's how to become an artist, but he does, in French it works, and a word play with a word for excellence. So artiste, which means excellent, and there's a T with in a parenthesis, artiste, and that's the title. So how to become excellent, how to become superlative, how to become an artist. And that's for artists, and artists hold a very special place in Peladan's heart and system, in fact, and we'll get to why. The other 3, the next 3, essentially go deeper. They're thematic rather than directed at a different group of people, and they explore the issues that he anticipates people will encounter if they take this path, in relation to political and social issues, in relation to metaphysics, and in relation to, I forget what the third is, but and in relation to religion. And the last one was written much later. It was written in 1911, I believe, and he calls it the science of love. And I forgot, the one is Traité des Antinomies. Yes, that's where he addresses all the potential contradictions that one may think they see, or may indeed see, in his work. So he tries to go deeper and address issues that perhaps he's discussed in the years that have intervened and so on, to try to give as spherical, as full a set of answers as possible to whoever decides to follow this kind of course of self-initiation for themselves. And the last one deals with the relationship between men and women, or the idealized couple, which is actually his end goal. Now, let me backtrack to explain that. All of this, you see, is situated within Peladan's incredibly coherent cosmology. And this cosmology is his answer to the problem of evil and his answer to the problem of the fall. Because Peladan cannot accept the idea of original sin. He cannot accept it, and he cannot accept that it's something that can't be fixed. And so he does all sorts of metaphysical gymnastics, rewrites the book of Genesis, draws on a number of different traditions, and collates certain points. and very, very much, very strongly relies, and again, I know some people are not going to like this, but he does rely very strongly on Plato. And Peladon ends up by saying, look, the original human being was the primordial androgyne, which was the fall, essentially entailed the division of this androgyne into the two, into male and female. Each got slightly different faculties because you had this one being and it couldn't be divided any other way. Now, each of those two halves needs to rediscover and set alight their faculties in order to come together in perfect union, because that's what platonic love really means. There's this misunderstanding that it means sort of fraternal love. That's not true at all. Platonic love actually means a deep, deep spiritual connection that is accompanied by an equally powerful erotic connection. And when two people come together with the same degree of awareness, which his handbooks are supposed to lead people to, then essentially they're recreating that, the primordial androgyne, and they can reach a point of integration with the divine within this lifetime, within the mortal lifespan, within the physical body. He had no problem with the material plane at all, but he felt that in order for us to realize that that spark of divinity is everywhere, this is the process that needs to be followed, you see.
Well,
So
and that is,
how
I'm going to say that's interesting because, again, for our listeners, there's a profound philosophical similarity with that and some of the Vajrayana, because those who undertake the particular practices on inner fire and the Tumo, it's clearly stated by many of the teachers that you can only achieve the highest state of awakening with a partner, that this is required. It's now, of course, they say there will be exceptions to this, but that for the average person, that it's required. So this notion of this bringing together of male and female in this heightened state of combined union. And thank you for clarifying about platonic love for us, because we've often talked about the power, the different types of love that we see bring in different esoteric systems. And of course, the hidden and often wink, wink, nod, nod understanding of the overwhelming force of Eros. But again, where is that taking us and to what end? And thank you for clarifying that. Now, he loved artists. Could you tell us a little bit why artists had a special place in his system?
So, yeah, Peladon's cosmology then is based on his own variation of the creation story, and this variation goes that humanity was created by the angels in the first place, and not by God. And so the angels are given the order to create humanity, and so they draw the silhouette of their own shadows, and they breathe life into this silhouette, and that becomes this androgyne, this primordial androgyne. So first of all, it's an act of art already. The very act of creating humanity is an artistic act. That's point one. Point two, the story then continues that the angels fell so passionately in love with their creation, so beautiful it was, that they immediately wanted to embrace it among their ranks and show it all the divine mysteries and so on and so forth. However, this is where Peladon then strays from the traditional Christian, or the traditional narrative, because he explains that there's no sort of act of pride involved. It's an act of over-enthusiasm. And there's an interesting point there, because the word enthusiasm in Greek, the etymology actually has this God within. Okay, so which may be familiar again to some listeners. So they become over-enthused out of their love for this creature they've made, But it itself is spun from their own shadows. And as such, it literally cannot handle, cannot hold the magnificence, as it were, of the mysteries they want to reveal to it. And because it's too late, they've already gone ahead and tried to do so. It's a bit like the story of Zeus and Semele, and you know what, Peladon may well have actually been inspired by precisely that story, where Zeus comes to her as the golden, I think it's a golden cloud if I'm not mistaken, but when in disguise in any case, and when she tricks him into promising to grant her any request, and she says, you've got to show me your true form, and Zeus doesn't want to show it because he knows it'll kill her, because of the radiance and magnificence is too much for her to bear. And Semele, of course, is the mother of Dionysus, and that's the start of the story that's at the heart of the Orphic tradition. So Peladon may well have drawn inspiration from that. So in any case, because this androgyne cannot, is not made of the right stuff, basically, it is placed into matter and separated by the very act of so doing, so that it through time and through the long cycles of time and evolution, in its mortal form, through temporality, it will eventually be able to awaken to these mysteries. But the only way that it can work without completely destroying it is by undergoing these many cycles of time. And, says Peladon, the angels responsible for all this were packed off after the poor androgyne who was thrown to earth, to jolly well look after it and help it through this process the slow way. So that's his version of the story of the fallen angels and his rewriting of the Enochian, of Enoch 1, essentially, yeah, and the angels that come and teach humanity. Which I think is incredibly beautiful as a story. Sorry, I always get beautiful romance, to be honest. But so why artists? That's I'm giving you the long answer, but I can't really give you the short answer because it doesn't make sense otherwise. Why?
Well, that's why we're here.
Because our creators were the first artists, and because it's only through the act of creation that we discover our divine origins, he says. And because also there's a bit about how eventually those fallen angels interbreed with humans because they have to, and he's actually put this in one of his novels. It's one of my favorite excerpts from him, actually. And therefore, according to Peladon, all artists and all the great thinkers and all the great lights of humanity, he believes, are actually daemons, are descended from angels. And therefore, for him, artists, and he's talking about almost the archetypal type who cannot live without making art of one form or another. It doesn't matter. It's not just visual art, obviously, it's all the arts. And philosophy as well. So for him, divine Plato is obviously one of the angels' descendants, and he believes he is too. Are ready-made initiates by virtue of their birth, and therefore they are the ones who are closest to the divine and able to show the way by kind of channeling this essence, if you like. So that's why artists, and therefore he thought, if I get them on side, I can get them creating a kind of art that will spark an awakening on a wide scale. And that's what his salons were really about. That's why he did the salons.
You know, just as a side note, I mean, even within Genesis, it says, you know, the Elohim said, "Let us create man in our own image."
Yep.
So we see this as this androgynous Elohim creating humanity, which, of course, in Genesis, there are really two creation stories there. So we see a similarity for the careful reader. But of course, he was being wonderfully influenced, as you mentioned, by the Greek philosophies and not as we think in the boring, stodgy way, but those wonderful kind of Orphic stories and initiatic aspects of the the Greek period. How do we then look at this art? Because his art, as you said, was meant to transform the observer. In this case, it would have been the viewer because it was mostly visual, although there would have been musical creations as well and plays. How would he have seen art as a transformative mechanism?
So let me just, in parenthesis, before I answer that, let me also say another very strong influence on him was Fabre d'Olivet, who
Okay.
also rewrote Genesis. And yes, it's because you mentioned the Elohim, it's precisely this question of how that's been translated and understood over the centuries and in various contexts. So Fabre d'Olivet comes along and says, no, 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 it's not just another name for God, it's something else.
Mm-hmm.
And Peladon does that again. So yeah, he does draw in these influences. Now, as to how the arts plural were meant to work, this is the beauty of it. With the arts plural, Peladon is taking aim at the animique, and the animique is a category of people who are just on the cusp of awakening. They can feel there's something more. They're not comfortable not in their own skin, but they're not comfortable in the kind of strictures society, you know, in modern terms now, speaking in modern terms, their tie is choking them. Those nice work shoes are cutting into their feet. They know there's something off. They know this world isn't, they don't sit easily within it, but they don't know what's wrong. That's his audience for the arts. And I say, and very clearly for the arts. Now, the beauty is they weren't supposed to do anything. They weren't supposed to do anything. The work was meant to be on the part of the artist of any type. And when he organized his salons, these really included sort of a group art exhibition, including sculpture, music specially written for the salons. So that's where he had Eric Satie on side,
Yes.
writing pieces dedicated precisely for this purpose. Peladon himself would deliver some lectures, which were indeed addressing a slightly more intellectual level, but were also they're quite rousing, quite flamboyant, perhaps. And then he also wrote several theatrical plays, which have the form of ritual theatre, and really were simply meant to spark this awakening by evoking, by invoking, by offering a narrative and offering imagery that would show an unsuspecting audience that there was something more. And his thought was, and this is exactly the same tactic he applied in his novels, his actual fictional novels, of which there were plenty, which I actually termed this literary esotericism, which is not a book that just features esoteric motifs, which we have plenty of, but it's a book which the actual act of reading is an act of esoteric praxis. And if you're going to get your head around it, by the time you've got to the end, there's a shift that's kind of occurred. And if that's worked in the reader, then it's also sparked them to take that next step. That's what Peladon intended them to do. Whether it worked is a question. But the idea really was get the unsuspecting reader on side and wake them up almost accidentally, if you like. That was the point of bombarding the public with art at every opportunity, but art with a message, obviously.
And I think, just to put this contextually, I don't know if you've listened to any of the interviews that I've done with different folks, but particularly David Metcalf in particular. We've spent a great deal of time going over occulture, that is occultism and pop culture. And, we have different take on it in a lot of I would say more contemporary folks do, because we're looking at it from a broader perspective, not just within the last 10 years or 20 years, but really over the last 100 or so, when we can begin to see more occult themes more easily coming into popular culture. And one of the things I had mentioned in an interview that I did just by accident, I really didn't even want to do it, but I thought, you know what, it seems like an interesting theme. We'll see how it goes. And it was a discussion of um, really the occult influences, occult New York in the 1970s.
Mhm.
And what we looked at that, though, is the way I looked at it at the interview, is how that we see as the beginning point of not only an increase in occult themes in pop media, it really is starting in the late 60s, but really it has this peak. But we also see a beginning of more nihilism. And we
Mm.
see this nihilism really begin to take firm root by around 2000. So if you start looking at the just tremendous number of shows that exist now, they're fundamentally negative when it comes to the whole situation. The way I described it is evil is present, God is absent, and humanity is without a hero. Now, I'm setting that up as a context, because now what I want you to talk about is what was the occulture, the culture built around the occult, esotericism, that Peladon was promoting, because it seems like it was 180 degrees from what I've just described would be what we'd see in contemporary culture.
See, Peladon would agree with you and say that art in his time was completely nihilistic and without meaning and without purpose and without a rudder. And there's plenty of different quotes I can think of where he's literally saying that art is dead and we need to, sort of, we need to, if there's brothers in all the arts, this is a battle cry or something like that. And
Mhm.
it's now we save Western culture or never. And what art is he's talking about French academic art of the time. He's talking about impressionism. He's talking and that's the sort of which is not academic, but which is also very much on the rise as an alternative scene, if you like. Now, for Peladon, it's about what kind of art does he want to see? He wants to see art with a deeper meaning, art with a soul, art that gives you no choice but to converse with what you're looking at in one shape or form or another. And it's not, what I like about it is not overtly occult. There are no
Mhm.
symbols, there aren't any sigils in there. There's no, really overt symbolism there. It's symbolist art, but it's figurative. It features human figures mostly, and mythological characters that have with a particular, so you get a lot of heads of Orpheus. If that's not a sort of, well, why are we looking at another disembodied head? Maybe time to find out who this guy is, and that sparks the journey. See, that may be one way to get somebody to actually go and make the effort to find out. There's angels, but there's angels that they're not just pretty angels. They're not cherubs. They are fulfilling a specific role. There's mythical topics, but they are either sort they're either showing a moment of change. They're showing a moment of death. They're depicting some forms of, quite scary things, sort of almost memento mori for the time. I'm thinking of Carlos Schwaber and specific graveside scenes when I say that. And so, and of course, that got Peladon's whole movement labeled as decadent by some ridiculous art historians. And I'm sorry, there's nothing further from decadence than Peladon's idea of trying to regenerate society through art. His was a pushback against decadence. So the nihilism that you speak of in our time, perhaps, or the last 20 years or so, I put it back even further. I'm thinking of conceptual art, especially for me
Well,
as well.
I was speaking particularly to occult, the way occult themes in popular media are presented. I was speaking particularly to
Oh,
that has been exceptionally nihilistic uh, in the last 20 years, and we see
yeah.
the slide over about the last 50, but really by 2000 and
Mm.
early 2000s, um, God is absent, evil's everywhere, heroes are dead, they're not here. You have no hero, no champion. There's no champion for humanity, you know.
Well,
And
you see, yeah. Well, you see what Peladon was saying, though. What he would answer right there is, well, then you be the champion. You be your own champion. Why do you need a champion? That's why he was so firmly against. He didn't set his artists up as celebrity heroes.
Mhm.
He told them, do what you were born to do, because this is what you were born to do, otherwise you're a waste of meat. If you see,
Yeah.
well, that's how he could be. But there's this beautiful line right in that book, how to become a mage, which says, are you going to look and are you going to check to see what I've borrowed from Pythagoras to decide whether I'm good enough for you? You be Pythagoras. Is he the best? You be the best. You be the next Pythagoras. He's really challenging his reader, you see. And there's these little lines get lost until you realize he's saying this literally. He means it. And that's the whole reason why he didn't want hierarchies. Again, in that same book, he has a line elsewhere saying, don't look for instructors, don't look for masters, sit with the elderly, but make sure they are elderly people who have comported themselves well and lived a good life. Sit at their feet and learn from them, yes, but don't look to be someone's disciple. He says things like that. So, and I'm responding particularly to your "there are no heroes" line, which is what
Yes.
Peladon saw too. He saw that too, but he thought he could possibly speak to the best in humanity in this way.
And as soon as you do that, well, he was already the hero. He was already the champion because he was doing his what he had to do, what his character made him do. I mean, and as encouraging other people to do the same. That's when they make that twist. They become the champion now. Maybe they've got some training wheels on, but they've moved up a notch. They're no longer um, uh, waiting for someone else to do the job that must be done. I just wanted to say I noticed a lot of strong similarities, although they come from different approaches, philosophically, between what Peladon was saying and what Jean Dubuis said. And he, of course, was the founder of the Philosophers of Nature, a French Alchemical Association that was quite well known in the United States, which I was a part of. But of course, he was an engineer. But a lot of the views in terms of personal responsibility and how to undertake that path of self awakening are very similar in what he spoke about.
Well, you'll see similarities with a number of, you'll see similarities with Jung's path to self-determination, for example. Actually, the more you drill down into the detail, the more similarities there are with Jung. And I struggled. I really thought I was onto something when I first noticed that. And I struggled for a while to see if I could actually prove a direct link. I failed to, which is not to say that I didn't miss something. And goodness knows, maybe somewhere out there, I hope a young scholar comes along one day and taps me and says, hey, that I found the link. I will jump for joy if someone does that. But still, we know that Peladon moved in the same circles as Henri Bergson, and we know that
Right.
Bergson influenced Jung. So there's definitely, they drank from the same cup. These ideas were very much the order of the day. So the way they were expressed, I've even heard it said that Peladon was trying to de-esotericize esotericism. That's a fair thing to say about him in some ways.
Well, and that's what Dubuis did. He specifically stated it. He was trying to de-esoterize esotericism to get rid of the obscuration, the unnecessary obscurations that he saw within it.
Yeah. And again, it's highly possible that there are links. I've no idea. But Peladon's reach, you see, was significant. Even though he kind of dropped into oblivion even before he died, and that we have largely his contemporaries to thank for that, but also his own mishandling, if you like, of the publicity that he got. Even so, he was read far more widely than one would think, and especially in other languages. So who knows? Who knows? Who knows how far his sort of flame traveled, even nonetheless. So,
what would be the, I'll just pick a number, 3 key ideas that Peladon would say to someone? The 3 key things they need to do, not to move in this direction of self-determined self-awakening, self-initiation.
well, you see, it's not as simple as that, really. But let's say, to kind of just make a start, first of all, be prepared to break all chains that keep you following society's rules. That's the first. And in parallel, rather, look within and decide who you really want to be. What are you going to carve out of that block of marble that you are? And thirdly, thirdly, I think he would say that you need to be consistent and totally honest with yourself, as you set out on the path, and be prepared to work hard and in a self-disciplined way, because he really does expect people to study. He expects people to pick up his references and go and look them up and read them. He doesn't just throw references out there. He says, okay, now Plato this, you're supposed to go and find that line, and then the piece it'll slot in and make sense. So it's those 3 things, really. I think be prepared to, it's not going to be easy. It's not always going to be easy, but the gift at the other end is being totally master of one's own self, and also on the metaphysical, on the spiritual level, participating in this apparent reintegration with the divine, this discovery of one's own divine self. And the idea being that once a critical mass has been reached, then this will happen across society, and everybody will be at one, and so on. So that's...
Now, where then did these, what was it, the reign of the Paraclete, the Holy Spirit, where did this, the Comforter, where did this role, what role did this play in his view? Or am I confusing that with, because that was part of the period, I may be confusing that with maybe with with Martinism.
I think so. I don't think that comes up as, I mean, he refers, you see, this is the thing, he refers to different, I suppose I can say, entities or different archetypes from different systems. And so he will refer to Assyrian deities and Kabbalistic Sephiroth and
Yes.
Christian sort of, well, again, sort of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Trinity, but also angelic figures. Then he'll refer to other mythical figures, and he creates a system of correspondences and openly says, some of these will work better for different people. Feel free to take your pick. Don't feel that the one path is better or more powerful than the other. Ultimately, and if you don't need to use these particular correspondences, then you don't even need to. But if you need them to kind of make sense of what I'm saying here, then feel free. And so yeah, I'm not making the connection in my head at the moment, but it could well be a different system, I think.
And it may just have to do with the general notion of social transformation that was prominent in some of the esoteric views of the period. That's, yeah. Well, I find this fascinating because he's saying many of the things that we hear today within the general framework of solo practitioner and self-initiation. But what we see in much of the literature aimed at that notion, I have to say, it is generally not reliable, in the sense that the notion of effort, the notion of personal reflection, the ideas that you've presented tend not to be there. A lot of the modern literature, and I use the word literature loosely because I doubt whether it's going to survive a generation, we should call it the publications, modern publications, often focus a great deal on ritualistic technique, something which you do, rather than something which you contemplate to become. If that makes sense, if I'm explaining myself correctly. So he is very much about finding this inner point and just bringing it forth in and through your life, and allowing that to expand and expand, and not just in a psychological state. That's the first part, that's the foundation. But that psychological state truly becomes psyche or soul as you become deified. There is a deification process at work here.
There is, but what's incredible about it is that it is deeply, deeply physical and deeply, deeply social, you see, because Peladon, there is no ritual, okay? Because for him, that's just a distraction and it's entirely unnecessary. And his use of symbolism, which we would normally find in a ritual setting, is totally absorbed within the arts, plural. The ritual space is your everyday life. And he even makes he seems to think of every eventuality. So he says, okay, the ideal thing would be for you to be earning a living in a way that does not require everyday contact with, you know, a sort of society. That may not be possible. I know that. He says so. He says as much. But what you are able to do within that context is to be awake and aware, and for your everyday life to become to make sure that you live it in a way that is still true to the person you're trying to become, to the self, to this process of self. He calls it self magification, and he spent a lot of there are several quotes, incredibly meaningful quotes about what magic is not, and what he's not promising. And he's ultimately saying that magic is the art of sublimation of man. There is no other definition. But if you're expecting gold making, if you're expecting fireworks, if you're expecting spirits to come and dance around you, I have no time for you. Go away and come back when you're ready to hear this. That's it. And so the ritual theatre, as I say theatre figuratively here, the ritual space is the life you lead, that your family life, your work life balance, which again is a very modern thing, and making sure that you remain true to that touchstone of who you're trying to become. And as you enact what Peladon calls it, the art of kaloproshopia, which is that's his word, sort of beautiful personality, beautiful personhood, that your every act, your every move, your every interaction reflects precisely what you're trying to achieve with this. And so that's what's really radical, I think, about what he's saying here, because it's easy to it's really easy to compare to modern self-help kind of programs, but it goes much, much, much deeper. And the point and the thing is, it's not about me. It's not about, oh, surviving isn't good enough, I've got to thrive. This is not about you and me. It's about humanity. It's about doing this in the Rosicrucian context, which is to contribute to the collective awakening and ascent, if you know, spiritual ascent of humanity itself. That's the end goal. It's not just so that I can be happy. It's got nothing to do with that, you see.
I think within, and again for the listener, this is the points you're making are interesting because within again within Tantra, it's the phrase is samsara nirvana of the same taste. But we see in Kabbalah, and I think it was may have been Dion Fortune who made it most popular, but the notion of Keter and Malkuth are of the same. And what happens is there is a tendency to dualize in a very profound way, to take the notion of that which is spiritual and make it so abstract and separate from daily life that we end up with what we see in psychology, or the psychologizing aspect of. And I want to ask you a question too. What did Peladon think of these deities and gods as separate entities, but within the framework of, when I say, you are a daughter of Hermes, I mean that. I'm not saying that as a abstraction. I'm saying that your notion as a esotericist, as a teacher, as a researcher, as an academic, all of these are Hermetic virtues. Mm-hmm. So I don't say, you're a daughter of Hermes like in a symbolic sense. I mean that quite literally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I see what you mean. But what Peladon would be saying is that all those names and all the god names, whether in all the pantheons there are, and that includes the angelic names, they are all just avatars of those first angels that came down with the broken androgyne.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So all the pantheons that we've, so Athena, Hermes, the whole lot of them, literally the whole lot of them, in any system, in any culture, in any civilization, ever since the sort of inception of humanity, they're just the avatars of those same angels who changed names depending
mm-hmm.
on the period they found themselves in, and that's who, and that's that.
But so, the qualities are quite literal and concrete in their expression. They're not an abstraction. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the critical point. Not so much what we call it, but he's saying these are not a stepping, that those virtues, those qualities, those powers are clearly present right here.
Yeah. Absolutely right. Yes, they're not nice ideas to sit here and play with. No, you've got to embody them. You've got to do it. You actually do have to go out and do this if you actually want to follow this system. Yeah, that is what he's saying. That is totally what he's saying.
Tell us about your class. Tell us about it. Come on.
Well, yes. I took some convincing, and there were requests, and I kind of thought, but anyway, so I've taken the first 6 of those 7 books that I talked about, which are Peladon's Amphithéâtre des Sciences Mortes, which is the amphitheater of the dead sciences, and he calls them dead sciences because, for reasons I probably don't need to explain, because this skill, if you like, of living has been lost. And I'm running a course of interactive workshops starting February 15th, which is less than a month away, in fact. It'll be 6 interactive workshops plus an introductory recorded lecture to kind of set the scene and put this in context. Each workshop will focus on the neophyte level, because he has 3 levels within these handbooks themselves. And each workshop focuses on one of the books, neophyte level only, simply because there's no time. You can't, I'm already packing it really tight. And what we'll be doing is I will be sharing the first part will be a presentation, lecture, and of the key points, the core points within that particular handbook. And then there's an interactive part where I'll be giving the group translated excerpts and talking points, and putting them into smaller groups with maybe 3 or 4, where they can actually discuss and go deeper and explore what this means to them. So if you can imagine, even what we've been talking about, where Peladon says, tomorrow when you go to work, throw off XYZ constraint that you've been functioning under. I want to say to the people in my workshops, because we've already got quite a lot of participants, but it's still open for registration. I want to be able to say to them, what would that look like for you? You go to work tomorrow and you're doing what Peladon says. What does it look like? How do you feel about it? How are you going to, what challenges are you going to meet? How are you going to handle those? I really want people to think their way into it, without that meaning that they actually have to apply it if they don't want to. I mean, that's I have to underline this. I am not an esoteric teacher. I am a scholar. I just happen to be the only English-speaking scholar right now who has gone across the breadth and depth of Peladon's work. And the only reason my book isn't out because of my study is because I think it's cursed. I've had several publisher disasters really, but we're nearly there and it should be out this year. Moving aside from that, my whole aim with these classes is really to distill and make accessible what is otherwise a vast amount of material, which doesn't really have a context because nobody's written it yet. And so, or I have, but it's not in print yet. And thereby, if people, it's appropriate for scholars and practitioners and artists, because each of those groups can really get something different out of it. And I will be speaking to all three groups as I go, but I also think that though all three groups really can learn from each other, and it might be incredibly valuable to have scholars, practitioners, and artists playing referees. I think artists are great referees if they're needed in that context, and to have the interactive part so that people can really think their way into this material, and then they can do with it what they want. They want to go off and paint, they can go off and paint. They want to go off and research, fine. They want to actually apply it in their own lives. Well, the good news is there will be anthologies coming out in the next few years, which I'm working on, that also distill this material. So otherwise they may have to wait just a little longer. But that's the point of the course, and it's kicking off on February 15th. I'm running it through Treadwell's books, so it's on the Treadwell's website, and I'm also broadcasting it on social media, so hopefully.
That's right, you are available on Facebook. What is your website?
So my website, which needs updating because this isn't actually on my website yet, but my website is sashachaitow.co.uk. And my dedicated Peladon website is peladon.net. And that's been up since 2011, I think. I've shared anything that I've put out and published on Peladon, any work I've done and made available is all on peladon.net. And it needs updating. I'll probably do that very shortly. So yeah, and that's where people can find out more about me, more about what I do, and more about, of course, about this.
So let me ask then, because it's impossible to be in this up and over your eyeballs as you have been, how have you been changed by Peladon?
Well, as I said, when I started out with all of this, I started out as an artist looking to learn my artistic language better, or to discover more artistic languages, because I wanted my art to be meaningful, and I wanted it to impact people. And I was trained in a very modernist school of art, which is all about me, and I didn't like that. I, having fallen into esoteric studies in general, and then having discovered Peladon, what was incredible, I ever since I think my very first exhibition, I was always inspired to paint verses of poetry, would give me mind pictures that I would then set down. song lyrics, lines of sort of quotes from philosophers and so on. So Peladon gives me this whole cosmology just begging for illustration. And he gives me a set of rules to go with it and tells me, hey, you may just wake up some people to discover their better selves as well. Well, you know, that's what Peladon gave me. He gave me almost infinite topics. His work really helped me see connections between various traditions as well and their application. And there's a brutal honesty to Peladon that I really like. It suits my temperament. And also, even though he has a sad kind of end and he dies thinking he's failed, it kind of, you know, academically, it almost gave me a purpose. This poor sod just wanted to help humanity, got a bit carried away. Let's see if I can't do something with this. So I don't know that it's changed me as me. I think what it did was it validated things that I thought only I thought when I was younger. I think that's what it did for me. And it made me see, it took me outside my sort of, you know, little world and showed me a much broader one and a much bigger one. So did it change me as me? I don't know anymore. It's been too long. It's been much too long. You know, I started with Peladon in 2009. That's when I started exploring him. It certainly made me a better artist. I'll say that. It certainly made me a better artist and made me stop caring even slightly about the whole playing the whole. I never wanted to play the game of sort of the whole art scene game and so on and so forth. But it made me stop caring about even trying that, you see. So that's something as well, I think. I care very little what people think nowadays. And that's that's Peladon's lesson number one. So.
Well, I found this whole conversation just wonderful. And it reminds me of a mutual friend of ours when we were having lunch one time. He said, well, I don't want to leave the world a better place because I really don't know what that is, but I do want to leave it a more beautiful place. And that seems to be what Peladon was after, that if we leave it a more beautiful place, maybe the part about better will just take care of itself.
That's absolutely the core of what he's saying, that beauty it will almost shame or force even the most kind of somnolent, sleepy fools into something slightly better. He even says somewhere else, you know, if you're going to be part of the mob, if you're going to be a beast, be a beautiful beast. Straight up. So yeah, exactly. If nothing else, let there be beauty. And if we're all going to hell in a handbasket, because which right now we look like we are, then at least let there be beauty.
Well, this was wonderful. I thank you so very much. And please restate the websites to go to for your course and for your writings on Peladon so that the listeners can have them. Yeah. It is
www.sashachaitow, or one word, .co.uk, and the easier one is www.peladon.net, and that is obviously what it says on the tin, dedicated to Peladon. And Treadwell's bookshop, if you just go to the website treadwells-london.com, I think, .co.uk, sorry, .co.uk, and just pop my name into the search function. That'll pop up everything I'm doing with them. So the course is on there as well.
And Google is our friend. So if someone can't quite find it with that, then maybe they won't be able to. They're being kept from the course then at that point. Higher forces are at work. But I think anyone will be able to find it. And we really look forward to hearing some of the results of the course, how people have enjoyed it, because hopefully it will be available after the fact in some recorded form for those who aren't able to make it. And I do hope that you will be having both the intermediate and advanced interpretations of the material. we look forward to hearing about that as well in the future. So thank you so very much for joining with us this day.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to. It's been great.